Good evening. Thank you so much for tuning in. I have been asked to give you just a moment or two to jump online. Apparently I am too swift in starting these videos, so apologies. So if you bear with me just for a few more seconds, just to enable people to jump on, and then we will get underway with tonight's video announcement. All right, I'm getting the green light to proceed. Very good. All right, good evening. My name's Antonia Mercarella. I'm the CEO of the Real Estate Institute of Queensland, or the REIQ as we're more commonly known. Thank you so much for tuning in. I know that many of you are tuning in, as you have been for a series of weeks now. So welcome back to those of you who have been watchers and supporters from the outset, but a special welcome to many of you who would be tuning in for the first time. I want to thank you for tuning in to hear this important announcement. Tonight's video is going to be wholly and solely dedicated to one issue. So when we last spoke to you Thursday night, just before the Easter break, we let you know that the Deputy Premier and Treasurer, Jackie Trad, and our Minister for Housing and Public Works, Mick de Brenni, had announced the special COVID-19 protection for real estate tenants and owners package. And that was announced just before we went to the Easter break. As many of you would be aware, we were concerned about many aspects of that package. We were taken by surprise. The announcement did not match what we were expecting in terms of how the moratorium would work. Tonight I'm letting you know that we have written to the Premier, Anastasia Palaszczuk, asking her to intervene in this matter and asking for urgent amendments to the proposed framework. Tonight, I'd like to take you through what our specific concerns are, and I would like to ask you to join us and to support us to ensure that when new laws are passed to deal with COVID-19 in relation to residential tenancies, that those laws are fair and that they are balanced. So let me first say this. I think this is very important to acknowledge. I'm aware that there will be tenants watching. We have received some comments from tenants in respect of our opposition to this package. And here's what I want to say to you if you are watching this as a tenant. We want to be very clear. We are the peak body for real estate. We do not want to throw tenants to the wolves. We absolutely support the introduction of an eviction moratorium. We absolutely support the implementation of protection measures. We don't want to see tenants being evicted due to financial distress caused by COVID-19. That would be unfair and it would be unjust, and we have said from the very outset that tenants need protection. In fact, I want you to know that the REIQ has been saying that moratorium should have been introduced a long time ago. That's what we've been advocating for. We have been advocating for certainty for tenants and for property owners. As the peak body representing real estate in Queensland for the last 101 years, we want and we support a stable property market. So we do not want to see tenants being evicted. We do not want to see you thrown out. That's not what we want. So I want to say that very clearly from the very outset. But we do have concerns about some elements of the package that the Palaszczuk government has announced. In particular, our concern is that this package, as it's currently proposed, ignores property owners. It does not give property owners a voice, and it eliminates basic fundamental rights that they have as owners. I want everyone to be aware that property owners, just like tenants, are very much vulnerable at this time. We have heard about tenants potentially losing work due to COVID-19. We absolutely understand and acknowledge that. But I want to be very clear, we are also hearing that property owners are also losing jobs and losing incomes. So what we are saying is that the package needs to be balanced and it needs to protect both tenants and owners. So the title of our campaign is Everyone Matters. So what I want to do now is take you through the specific key concerns that we have so that you can understand why we are actually opposed to some elements of this package, keeping in mind that the fundamental principle behind the package, the 6-month eviction moratorium, is something we do support. So let's start with perhaps the most critical issue. We have known that an eviction moratorium was coming for many weeks now. It's something that our Prime Minister announced 3 or 4 weeks ago, and we have gradually been learning about what this moratorium will look like. It's been very clear, not from the outset, but certainly from a few weeks in, that the moratorium was not designed to allow a rent holiday. Indeed, we heard the Federal Minister for Housing announce several weeks ago, and I quote, "If you can't pay your rent now, you have been given a grace for 6 months, but we'll have to catch it up when you are able to pay it again." That's from our Federal Housing Minister. At a state level, whilst I'm not at liberty to discuss specifically what we have been discussing with the Department of Housing and Public Works, I can say to you with confidence that we were working under the premise that what was being discussed was a rent deferral. If tenants were unable to pay their rent, they could reduce the rent due to financial distress, but ultimately the rent would be payable. What the Palaszczuk government has introduced, however, is something quite different. It is effectively a rent waiver. Property owners are actually being asked to offer rent reductions, and they are no longer able to recover the rent thereafter. Let me explain that more clearly. You may have heard Minister de Brenni talking about not allowing rent arrears to amass. I believe that's the language he's used. Let me be really clear about what that means. It means that as an owner, you will be compelled to negotiate with your tenant, as you should, as we have agreed, but that once you negotiate a rent reduction, and it might be that it goes from $400 a week down to $200 a week, once you have negotiated that rent reduction, it is reduced into writing, and thereafter, that is your new rent. You will never be able to recover the unpaid rent ever again. And that is very different to what we had discussed and what the federal government had announced. In fact, surprisingly, it goes even further than the Code for Commercial Leasing. It imposes an even greater obligation on mum and dad investors who are expected to no longer be able to recover that rent that they have missed out on. And I'll explain why that's so detrimental in just a moment. So first of all, I want to tell you what Minister de Brenni has recommended to owners. He has recommended, and on the Hub website, there is literally one sentence dedicated to the protection available to owners. And here's what it says. Owners should talk to their banks. Here's how that actually looks in reality. That sounds simple enough. But the reality is we don't have consistency. The big four banks are not consistent when it comes to the approach on rental pauses, or rather, I beg your pardon, mortgage repayment pauses. It varies in terms of what the big four are offering. I can tell you that I have spoken to owners who have actually been in contact with their bank to ask for repayment pauses, and they are still waiting for an answer weeks later. But it gets worse than that. Because here's the harsh reality of it. You may be able to negotiate a pause in repayment, but it's only a pause. Interest will continue to accrue, interest will continue to capitalise, and ultimately you will need to pay that money back. It is not a repayment waiver that matches what tenants are being offered. And it's also important to note that because we were all expecting the eviction moratorium to be limited to only 6 months at most, it's unlikely you will be able to press pause for as long as you need to here in Queensland. Let me explain what I mean by that. our government has gone beyond what the federal government has announced, which is a 6-month moratorium. They have effectively stretched that out to be a 12-month eviction moratorium. They have effectively said that your tenancy agreement will automatically be extended for another 6 months. So not only are you being asked to waive the rent, to basically never see it again, not just for 6 months, but for 12 months, potentially up to 12 months. Because irrespective of whether the tenant is affected by COVID-19 or not, if that tenancy agreement falls due during the freeze period of the moratorium, then the tenant will be immediately entitled to another 6-month extension if they want it. It is totally at the tenant's election. So I don't know of any banks that are going to be offering a pause on repayments for 12 months. In fact, I would argue that in some cases we're going to be flat out getting any repayment pause. I also want to turn now to landlord insurance. So this has been widely and falsely represented as the solution for many owners. Landlords insurance will not help you, unfortunately. And indeed, we've seen in recent weeks that insurance companies have, for good reason, stopped offering landlords insurance. You haven't even been able to buy a policy if you wanted to. So first of all, it's important to remember that not all owners have landlords insurance. They simply can't afford it. And even for those who do have landlords insurance, it will not protect you in these circumstances because, as many of you would be aware, the way that landlord insurance protection works when it comes to rental defaults is that there needs to be a rental default, funnily enough. And therefore, there's a process that needs to be followed. Owners, in order to claim on that insurance, need to take certain action, mitigating steps. They need to issue here in Queensland a Form 11 and then ultimately a Form 12 to evict the tenant. And then once that process has been actioned, then potentially, depending on the terms of the policy, you will be entitled to protection under the insurance policy. That will not be available to you here because the government has dictated that you need to negotiate and come to a mutual agreement. And once you do that, effectively, your insurance policy becomes completely redundant and pointless. And just so you know, we have certainly communicated that on multiple occasions to Minister de Brenni, to the Department of Housing and Public Works. It's not a secret we've been keeping. And then finally, I guess the part that is most confusing is, apart from the fact that this has gone from a rent deferral to a permanent rent waiver, what is surprising about the fact that our government is being so particularly generous in terms of what this package offers. What's surprising about that is when you consider the median rent here in Queensland. Excuse me, I'll just have a drink. So let me explain what I mean by that. Excuse me. In Queensland, the median weekly rent for a 3-bedroom house is $360. For a 2-bedroom unit or apartment or townhouse, it's $355. So when you consider that against the various financial grants and relief that's been announced at a federal level as well as at a state level, the stimulus package that's been offered, it is difficult to understand how in most circumstances that relief will not be sufficient to allow the majority of tenants to pay their rent, or at very least, the majority of the rent they have to pay. Now, obviously, every situation needs to be assessed on a case-by-case basis. So again, that is confusing to us, given that that money is there to be used specifically for that purpose, so that all of us can continue to live and meet the basic necessities of life. And so, again, that's confusing. Excuse me. And then finally, as many of you would be aware, we have been disappointed to discover that Minister de Brenni had initially made it very clear, as did the Tenancy Hub website, that tenants would not be required to substantiate a request for rent reduction. He has made it very clear in the videos he has put out with the Deputy Premier, in his press announcement, and indeed on the Tenancy Hub. On our reading, it's been very clear that tenants were not expected to provide anything to landlords to allow them to actually substantiate, to allow them rather to assess the request for rent reduction. And we've said from the outset that we think that's unreasonable, that it is unreasonable for a tenant to simply have to request that and not to provide any form of evidence to enable an owner to make an informed and fair decision about the rent reduction that is reasonable to the circumstances of the tenant. What I will say to you is late today, I did receive some notification from Minister de Brenni's office that they intend to resolve that confusion and that in actual fact, tenants will be required to provide certain information and certain documentation to owners. Now, I won't say anything more than that at this stage until we know exactly what that looks like. But I am pleased to say that in that area, it seems that some degree of reasonableness and sanity seems to be returning, which is good. Let's hope it spreads to the other areas. So I want to move now on to the second key concern we have, and I've touched on this very briefly already, and that is that under this package, tenants will have an immediate right to a further 6-month extension when their tenancy agreement falls due. And this applies irrespective of whether the tenant is impacted at all by COVID-19. And so the Hub website does talk about that very clearly. Now, I want to explain what the practical effect of this extension is, because it is very damaging, and with all due respect, I do not believe the government has stopped to consider the impact that this kind of an extension will have. I've already outlined the impact it will have on owners who are unlikely to be able to negotiate a repayment pause for 12 months with their bank. But further to that, here are some examples of why we think that's concerning. As you can imagine, many owners at the end of a tenancy agreement will be planning to move into that property themselves. They may be in financial distress and they need to move back in, or they may need to move one of their family members back in, and they're planning to do that when that tenancy agreement ends. That won't be permitted. Similarly, if you were looking to sell that property, it's hard to see how you could do that under the terms of this moratorium. We'll talk a little bit later on around tenants' right to refuse entry and the impact that that will have on any owners trying to sell their property during this moratorium period. And then most concerningly, what hasn't been considered is the impact that this extension will have on properties that are already under contract or sales contracts that are in progress. So let me be clear about that. The Hub website makes it clear that if an owner has issued a notice to leave before the 29th of March, then that will generally apply and the tenant will need to go. The agreement will indeed end. However, that seems to only be applicable where the notice to leave was issued pre-29 March. Now stop to consider the number of contracts that may be on foot where the settlement period, where the contract is already in motion, it's already been executed by the parties, and the settlement date has been negotiated as a settlement date that falls after the tenancy agreement has lapsed. And for those of you who are familiar with the REIQ contract endorsed by QLS, what that says is that you either sell that property subject to the tenancy agreement, and therefore the new owner takes the obligations of that tenancy agreement on, obligations and the rights I should say. But if you have said you are selling it with vacant possession and indeed you have negotiated a settlement date that is post the date of the tenancy agreement ending, you will suddenly find yourself unable to meet that contract. You will be potentially in breach of that contract because you will no longer be able to give that property with vacant possession to the purchaser. So not only does that create huge contractual risk for owners, it also creates a massive headache for purchasers who were planning on settling and potentially moving into that property or renovating or whatever else it might be. So those are the kinds of concerns that we have, and we don't believe that this has been fully considered. And then finally, other issues that we have concerns about in terms of that 12 months is that, again, our concern is because the terms of the moratorium allow the tenant to no longer allow entry for anything seemingly other than emergency repairs, it's then concerning to understand how an owner can continue to meet their various statutory and legal obligations. And so some examples are things like safety switches, smoke alarms, pool safety fences. There's a list that goes on. And that's not to mention just your everyday requirement to keep the property in good repair, the inclusions in the property in good repair. So if you can't gain access for those purposes, what it will mean is that owners, landlords, and indeed property managers will be at risk of breaching various statutory obligations and facing potentially personal injuries claims, professional negligence claims, and of course various fines under the different governing legislation that applies to all of those safety related requirements. So let's move on. That's a good segue to our next concern, which is the fact that under this package, landlords will be required to continue with their obligation to undertake emergency repairs, which we are very supportive of. We've said that from the outset, that should absolutely remain. It is essential that emergency repairs continue to be effected. However, what appears to be clear from the Hub website is other than allowing entry to tradespeople for the purposes of undertaking emergency repairs, tenants will have the ultimate right to reject any other entry requirement. And so this might extend to things like, I know anyone who's watching who sells property, immediately you will be asking, well, how does this impact if I'm trying to sell a property? It's a great question. As we read it, tenants will be entitled to deny entry to prospective purchasers and to various other third parties like pest and building inspectors and valuers in connection with sales contracts. So I won't go on and on about this. You can use your imagination in terms of the incredible impact that this will have. There will be owners who will be unable to sell their properties at this time, even if they are in financial distress or even if they have their properties currently on the market. It's difficult to see how sales can continue with those sorts of restrictions imposed. Again, as I've said before, I hope I'm wrong in terms of the way we've interpreted that. And also, what we're also concerned about from a property management perspective in particular is that routine inspections are not allowed to be conducted physically. We have said before we agree with that. However, it should be therefore mandatory for tenants to have to participate in virtual inspections. Routine inspections are very important. They're important to tenants and to owners. They ensure that any kind of repairs or maintenance that needs to be carried out can be identified very early. It prevents personal injury to tenants within the property. And of course, from an owner perspective, it's important that you keep the property, the asset you own, in a state of good repair so that its value is not impaired. So it is concerning to note that on the Hub website, and I quote, here it says, as a tenant, you are under no obligation to conduct virtual inspections. So on the one hand, government is saying that routine inspections shouldn't occur physically, but rather should occur by virtual inspection. But then on the next hand, they're saying, tenant, if you don't feel like letting anyone in, and if you don't, well, not even that, if you don't feel like participating in a virtual inspection, you don't need to do so. We think that's unreasonable, and we think that needs to be changed. And as you would expect, given who we are and what we stand for, we do want to see the sale of tenanted properties to be allowed to continue. We have said from the very outset that safety needs to be the number one priority at this time. We are seeing that the vast majority of the real estate profession is responding in a highly professional and responsible manner. We are very happy to support all of the existing measures that are in place. We have been advocating from the very start that only 2 people should be permitted in at the one time, and of that 2, one of those includes the agent. We are happy for the government to mandate that. Indeed, I would argue that's already mandated by way of the health direction. Secondly, we are absolutely saying that the majority of the work should happen online, that you should not be bringing people in unnecessarily. You need to only bring in very, very qualified people to inspect the property. And of course, finally, we are saying that all the necessary health, safety and hygiene related protocols must be strictly adhered to. So we really need to see some balance in this area, completely appreciating that at this time people are very sensitive to allowing people within their property, but we need to find better balance on that issue. And finally, the final concern we have about this package is, I'm going to call it the little surprise that came out of nowhere. And so in addition to all the various tenant protection measures that I've just walked you through, which, as I've already highlighted, go above and beyond what other jurisdictions have either implemented or are implementing, here's what will apply in Queensland if this framework is adopted in its current form. And that is that, notwithstanding the multiple protections that tenants have, a tenant will ultimately have the right to break the lease. They will have the right to break the lease, to break the contract, and the only consequence will be that they need to pay 1 week's rent. For those of you who are familiar with this process, normally in a break lease scenario, it's like breaking any contract. If you break a contract, it gives rise to damages. In this context, if I'm a tenant and I break a lease, usually I will be responsible for that rent, for the payment of the rent until a new tenant can be procured. And in addition to that, generally, the tenant is responsible for letting fees and even potentially advertising and marketing expenses. In this case, government is saying to the tenant, you can trot off with 1 week's rent. So on top of everything else that the owner is being asked to do, they are also being told that they have to let the tenant go free, and the most that they can ask for if the tenant chooses to break the lease is 1 week's rent. So I hope that that gives you an understanding of why we feel so strongly about this issue, why we are asking you tonight to join us in our campaign to ensure that we can seek some urgent amendments to this proposed protection framework. I don't want to keep saying what I said at the outset. We absolutely support the moratorium, but this package goes too far. It goes far further than the federal government ever intended. And I just want to be really clear here. All we are saying is we want to see both tenants and landlords or owners protected. And I want to also say something else. It actually pains me to sit here launching a campaign against this government at the present time. I say that with complete sincerity. It is the last thing the government needs, and I can assure you, it is the last thing that the REIQ needs right now. But we can't stay silent, and we have tried to behave in a responsible way. We have participated in hours and hours of meeting and consultation. And then this is the outcome. So we can't stay silent. We have no choice but to speak out. We are not trying to be obstructionist. We are not trying to increase the load of the government. I acknowledge that the state government has an incredibly challenging job at this time. Incredibly challenging. We actually want to be supporting the government. In fact, for the last several weeks, we have been supporting the government. So this is not something we are enjoying, but we feel that we must do it, because if we don't, there doesn't seem to be anyone else that is speaking out for property owners, that is speaking out for balance, and is saying that owners like tenants need to be protected at this time. So thank you for listening to that overview. Now I want to tell you what we need you to do to get on board and to add your voice to ours, to help us amplify our message to the Premier and to the state government. It's actually very, very simple. We've made it incredibly simple for you. So anyone listening to this video who is concerned, whether you are a real estate practitioner, whether you are a Queensland property investor, whether you are someone who is just concerned about the impact that this will have on people you know who are property owners, or you're just concerned about the incredible impact that this will have on the Queensland economy, here's what I want you to do. I want you to go to our website. I'll give you that address in a moment, and I want you to look at 2 letters. For the real estate agents out there listening, there is a letter for you that we are asking you to send to every single landlord client you represent. To the owners listening, who perhaps are self-represented, read that letter. That letter outlines, in summary, what the proposed changes look like and why we are concerned. So that's letter number 1. Letter number 2 is a template letter we have created for you. You can vary it, to the Premier, asking her to reconsider. It reflects and matches the letter that the REIQ has sent to the Premier. So I'll now give you that website. It is www.reiq.com/everyone-matters/. I'll say that one more time. www.reiq.com/everyone-matters, one word, /. Many of you who are members would have already received the information we sent via email tonight, so check your inboxes. But for those of you watching who are not members of the REIQ, that material is available free of charge for you to use, for you to share to each and every person that you know who is concerned about this. So we don't have long, ladies and gentlemen. We have 8 days. Parliament sits again on the 22nd of April. We are under enormous pressure. Time is not on our side. So what the REIQ is asking each and every one of you listening and watching is please, please help us. Share this video with everyone you know. Share it with everyone. It will remain on our Facebook page and people can watch it. Share the link. Please direct people to that website, share those letters, and please, most importantly of all, send that letter to our Premier so that she understands how important this issue is to every single Queenslander and understands the need for a more balanced framework and a framework that offers protection to both tenants and owners, because remember, everyone matters. Thank you so much for listening. Thank you for your support. We are all in this together. If we all speak with one unified voice, we will be heard. Have a great night, everyone. Thank you for watching.